What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, the Resident Evil series is something that has really gotten its hooks into me since playing the Resident Evil 2 remake for the first time in early 2022. I'm not entirely sure what it was that compelled me to finally take the plunge, but I'm obviously glad I did, considering I've played most of the games available on modern platforms. To be more specific, the RE2, RE4, and RE3 remakes, in that order, in addition to RE5 and both of the Revelations games. Leading up to the release of Requiem, I also played a couple chapters of RE6 with a friend of mine, but I honestly wasn't really into what I had played of it, so we'll see if I ever get back to that. Now, on the topic of my expectations for Resident Evil Requiem, while I obviously knew going in that this game was going to alternate in some capacity between more traditional survival horror gameplay as Grace and more modern action gameplay as Leon, what I did not expect was the role reversal of not only how each of these characters function in terms of the narrative, but also the role reversal in how I ended up feeling about each of their sections compared to what I was anticipating going in. I do want to issue a brief spoiler warning. This game's been out for a little while now, and I'm hoping for this video to be a little bit deeper than the average should you buy this or not style overview video, because I really enjoy my time with this game. I think it's great and have absolutely zero regrets in terms of paying full price for it. Though I suppose that's easy for me to say since I've only paid full price for like 2 of the games in the series. With all that said, let's get started. I kind of view Resident Evil Requiem as being in 2 halves, even though you do bounce between playing as Grace and Leon here and there during each of those 2 halves. I think it works out almost exactly to be a 50-50 split in terms of my Steam clock for this game being at 14.5 hours, 7.5 of which I know was spent from the beginning all the way up to the Raccoon City segment, and then the remaining 7 hours, I guess, was Raccoon City to the end, even though my total playtime, according to the results screen in-game, was closer to 10.5. With that said, let's dig into what I'm deeming as Grace's half, being the beginning all the way through the lengthy medical center portion of the game. What I want to touch on first is perspective in Resident Evil Requiem, and I mean that quite literally by the fact that you can choose whether you want to play in first or third person as both Grace and Leon, though the default and developer intended method is to play Grace in first person and Leon in third person. As someone who hasn't played Resident Evil 7 or 8, I think that the first person perspective lends itself to and fits with the slower paced, more traditional survival horror gameplay. So much so that I actually kind of hope they keep the option to play in first or third person in following Resident Evil games, be it remakes or new entries. I just found it to be a very compelling way to play these sections. The way that Grace was portrayed in this game also really added to the level of immersion and tension and fear that her sections provided. Shout out to Angela Santalbano for her performance as Grace. I thought it was actually pretty incredible. While I have enjoyed past Resident Evil stories, I wouldn't necessarily say that I've been particularly engrossed or overwhelmingly compelled by them. But with Grace's segments, I can definitely say that I was. In fact, I think that this entire first half of the game is pretty fucking excellent. Even though Leon's sections in this first half are pretty sporadic, I think that his gameplay style works kind of perfectly as brief action-packed catharsis surrounded by Grace's more tense and deliberate exploration. It was very surprising to me that I enjoyed Grace's sections as much as I did, because it was her style of gameplay that I was the most hesitant and skeptical about going in, as someone who historically has deemed himself more of a casual action Resident Evil fan, at least in terms of how much I really loved the Resident Evil 4 remake in particular. Now, in terms of narrative in this first half, I found it to be, much like the gameplay and just this entire section in general, highly compelling, with Grace as an FBI agent investigating the site of her mother's death, only to be captured by Dr. Gideon and taken to the medical center in question to have whatever experiments done to her. Grace meeting Emily, someone who was obviously experimented on to some degree and was being held captive in the medical center, leading to the question of what exactly was going on in the medical center, what was Dr. Gideon's involvement, in addition to Leon being infected with a T virus, and he ultimately ends up getting wrapped up into being Grace's savior, where she has been victimized by a combination of her past and, you know, literally her kidnapping and stuff like that. But even during this first half of the game, I really appreciated and enjoyed watching Grace gradually become more confident and stronger in terms of facing the atrocities and horrifying things that she has to face. I don't really think there's much else in particular that I want to touch on for this first half, other than I just want it to be known that you don't need to get all of the coins in the medical center to get all of the upgrades. I ended up with an excess of I think 3 or 4 because there are a few scattered about the courtyard once you do get out. I never tried to go back in because I did do the roulette minigame to get the quote-unquote last coin that you need to upgrade the blood collector. I played on standard modern, if that has any effect, which I guess I should note, the blood collector crafting kind of stuff I really ended up enjoying and thought added to the scrappiness of the survival horror gameplay, even though crafting systems can be a little bit hit or miss depending on execution, but I think here it was executed pretty well overall. I thought this second half kind of killed the momentum of the excellent pacing of the first half. Yes, it's nice to have this multi-hour section just playing as Leon mostly uninterrupted. It kind of pulled me out of my investment for the overarching narrative. And then when the narrative picks back up, more so in the lab, there were a number of cracks that I thought started to show. My play sessions got shorter and a little bit more sporadic during this section, even though on paper I should love it because RE4 Remake is one of my favorite games in terms of more recent releases. But to me, Leon ultimately ended up feeling more like an RE4 Remake light rather than a more fully featured follow-up to what that game did. While I did find playing as Leon very fun, it's more so that it didn't feel like it had the same depth or maybe more importantly longevity of progression as RE4 Remake for me to feel as high on his sections in comparison to the RE4 Remake, which after finishing Requiem I would probably much rather play to get a taste of this style of gameplay than go back and play Requiem specifically to play as Leon. And this goes back to what I said in the first half about Leon's gameplay in this game working so well as these intermittent bursts of adrenaline, rather than being something that I think in its current form is able to sustain itself on its own. It actually has me very interested about what the original vision for RE9 must have been, given all of the rumors and maybe leaks about it being an open world in Raccoon City, which obviously open world kind of has this stigma attached to it. I actually think it could work well, maybe not so much as an open world in the traditional sense, but more so a big 3D Metroidvania in terms of Resident Evil's propensity to have lock and key backtracking akin to the Metroidvania genre, even though it's not ability based in a lot of cases. I found a lot of the boss fights to be kind of underwhelming. There's not really a traditional boss fight as Grace, although I think for that style of gameplay, the hide and seek, shining the lights on the girl is a more fitting style of boss fight for the way that Grace plays. So yeah, most of the bosses you fight as Leon. I liked the spider boss. I thought it was actually kind of cool the way that it crawls over the environment and it's so large that you can't really get a break away from it, and it's difficult to get shots in on its weak spot unless it's getting ready to attack you, in which case I kind of fell for that trap quite a few times. I never quite got into the groove of parrying as much as I was used to in RE4 Remake, somehow forgetting in some cases that that was a part of my arsenal, but I still ended up being able to scrape by just fine despite not really feeling like I was playing very well. Obviously if I were to go back and play on the newly unlocked hardest difficulty, I'm sure it'll be different, but this didn't resemble my experience with past Resident Evil bosses. And I think that bosses in Resident Evil have definitely been very hit or miss in a lot of cases. But when you have the highs of the bosses of Resident Evil 4 Remake, for instance, which I thought were largely great, I just kind of came away from these bosses feeling a little underwhelmed. You have the motorcycle chase, which was dumb, campy, fun, not particularly deep in any way, but I do think it's interesting considering Resident Evil has quite a few on-rails shooters in its catalog. It had the cool factor going forward enough for me to not really be bothered by the simplicity of it. The RPD section I thought was actually pretty disappointing though. Of course, the callback of the Tyrant chasing after you very briefly, mind you, and you don't even need to fire a single shot at him. I get that Raccoon City was blown up to, a certain extent at least, but given how much weight they put behind showcasing the RPD in trailers and stuff, I kind of expected it to be a larger section of the game with maybe a little bit more puzzling going on. And I get that that's not really Leon's role in this game, but it still kind of left me feeling underwhelmed. And then I forget if it's before or after this that you play the flashback as Grace, quote unquote, even though it's highly likely that it's not her, and it might even be confirmed to not actually be her, considering the major twist, which is actually kind of interesting in that Grace isn't actually this special person that the villains think that she is. I'm trying to recall the exact context behind that whole orphanage flashback scene, whose perspective it's really from, or if it's like video footage or something. It's sort of made out to be that Grace is reminiscing on this, but I don't think it's actually her. Correct me if I'm wrong, because she would have been adopted by Alyssa from Spencer, and that's like the whole point of that reveal later on in the lab section. I guess it's intended to be a red herring of sorts in terms of the mystery, not only kind of a pace killer in terms of what I would anticipate on a replay, but also just ultimately kind of a non sequitur in terms of the narrative relevance to the characters that are actually important. I think the Arc Lab kind of bucks this trend that I've experienced in many Resident Evil games. Typically, I find the final area to be the weakest, but here, not so much. It actually contains some of my favorite stretches of gameplay, not quite to the extent of the medical center, of course, but in my opinion, better than the lab sections in RE2 and 3 remake, and overall more enjoyable than the island section of RE4 remake. Now, despite my praise of the lab section from a level design standpoint, you could say, I did feel pretty overpowered during it, with more than enough supplies to make all of the Molotovs and acid bottles that I needed as Grace, to the point where even though you could and I did at times sneak by some of the liquors, I was able to easily dispatch of the vast majority of them with the supplies that I was able to garner. Part of that might have been some stuff that I held over from the medical center, but I don't know, there's a lot to find, and that's satisfying to a certain extent, of course. And again, on a higher difficulty, maybe one acid bottle is not enough to kill a liquor, or multiple if you hit multiple at once. And then in terms of Leon's resource management, it was kind of just a non-issue. I was able to conveniently get any and all shotgun shells that I needed. The more that I talk about it, the more I think that just the standard difficulty was easier than I would have liked. And I don't think that there was a higher difficulty option. Of course, there was classic mode, which uses ink ribbons for saves and stuff, but I don't assume that would have any modifiers on damage taken and damage dealt or anything like that. And one other thing that I can praise this lab section for is it actually made me enjoy fighting gun-wielding enemies in Resident Evil, where I usually find it to be highly annoying when zombies have guns, for instance, but the way that they wield the guns in this game is not only more fitting to how a zombie would use it, they kind of just spray it across horizontally. I don't think I've ever encountered a sequence in a Resident Evil game where you fight against uninfected human enemies that are actually competent at weaving around you and shooting at you actively. But I found that to be an interesting surprise and a nice little change of pace. And of course, you have the fight against what I would presume to be Hunk, which is a fun bit of fan service. But again, to draw comparisons to RE4 Remake, sort of a weaker version of the Krauser duel from that game. And then at least Krauser also gets an additional boss fight later on to complement the pure knife fight. When the narrative starts to pick up again in terms of pace, I feel like it starts to feel kind of convoluted by virtue of a lot of these plot beats being rushed through during this lab section. If it was spread out a little bit more during the Raccoon City section, then like maybe, but there's some actual plot beats that, regardless of how they were doled out, I don't think necessarily really worked for me that well. So firstly, I already touched on the fact that Grace is not special. She doesn't have magic DNA or knows the secret password or whatever. She happens to uncover that from the data that her mother left behind. It was kind of interesting to see what I would presume to be one of Wesker's clones get duped and accidentally cure himself of his viral superpowers or whatever. Even though that led to him feeling like a lame villain, the more I think about it, I actually like his function as more of a red herring for the true final antagonist being Dr. Gideon, who I can only say that I wish had more screen time in the middle section of the game. You chase after him on the motorcycle as he's trying to shoot you with RPGs, but beyond the very beginning and the very end, he's just not really present, which leads him to feel a little underwhelming. With little screen time he had, I liked. It just wasn't really enough to flesh him out as a super memorable Resident Evil villain, which I guess, to be fair, has also been something that's a little bit hit or miss throughout the series, with some major exceptions, of course. I did think it was interesting that Elpis ends up turning out to be the cure for these bioweapons that Oswald Spencer initially was developing, but had a change of heart later in life, leading to his development of Elpis. I'm just trying to think back on how it might have been that Alyssa got this information, but she was a reporter and she was interviewing Spencer and adopted Grace and stuff, so it can be presumed that he gave this information to Alyssa, like, hey, you know, if you happen to dig into this deeper and gain access to the Arc lab or something, this is the password to release Elpis. It is one of those things where the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I don't know how exactly this entirely lines up. Usually I think the best stories, in particular when it comes to games, have a clear and coherent way in which the events make sense, but then you can dig deeper into themes and lore and implications for sequels or prequels or whatever. But here, it just kind of feels a little messy. Maybe there's some things that I'm missing by virtue of the games that I haven't played, but from what I understand, I think that a lot of this stuff is new to Requiem in particular, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it. I just think that as a self-contained story, Requiem has a lot of interesting ideas that don't necessarily tie together in a way that I came away feeling like it was intentional. However, I would be remiss to not discuss this, and I sort of set this up in the first half in terms of Grace being a victim and Leon being her savior. I really liked what they did to reverse the roles of Leon and Grace towards the end, as Leon is suffering more and more from his T-virus infection, and Grace is becoming more confident in herself. She ends up being Leon's savior, as Leon is treated more so as the victim, literally by his virus, but also where he is at mentally in this game, given all of the traumas that are dug up by him revisiting Raccoon City and the RPD, feeling the weight of his repeated inability to save the people that he's trying to protect. I guess with the major exception being Ashley Graham, but that didn't seem to get brought up at all. Leon's been fighting this fight for decades at this point. No wonder he's starting to feel exhausted by how much damage the Umbrella Corporation has wrought, even beyond them officially disbanding in the public eye. And so Grace kind of turning into this savior figure for Leon is just a really touching and satisfying aspect of this game's narrative. That's just kind of what struck me as far as the narrative elements of this game, as opposed to the literal plot of it. And even though it does feel like a little bit of a cop-out, I do like that at the end they are able to save Emily from her transformation. It's too heartwarming for me to be too upset about it. And then of course there is a bit of a tease of Chris and Leon teaming up at some point. But to start to wrap things up here, based on everything I've said in this video thus far, Grace not only became the savior to Leon's victim by the end of the game where they started in the opposite positions, but also in terms of my personal enjoyment of the game, it was this role reversal of going in expecting the Leon sections to be my absolute favorite part because of how much I loved RE4 Remake, and for Grace's sections to be fun on a first play, but maybe not something that I necessarily want to go back to or whatever, but instead coming away sort of feeling the opposite, where I thought that Grace's segments were much stronger than Leon's, even though I did enjoy both parts and enjoyed this game as a whole. I'm not exactly itching to jump into a second play right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if I came back to it someday and played it on the hardest difficulty, cleaned up some achievements. That is ultimately part of the Resident Evil experience, replaying with the new unlocks that you are able to access. With all that said, I'd be curious to hear from you guys as far as what you thought about Resident Evil Requiem, and if anything that I've said in this video resonates with you, or if you respectfully disagree or anything along those lines. In terms of what I plan to do next with Resident Evil, I'm actually very excited to dive into the classic RE games, as that is the era of this series that I'm the least familiar with, I guess with the exception of the Winters duology, of course. Whether or not I will for sure play every single classic Resident Evil in full and or make videos on them, it'll just kind of remain to be seen, but I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up making more Resident Evil videos on this channel, least of all to eventually get back to talking about Resident Evil 4 Remake once again, since I feel like I could make a video that does that game and how I feel about it more justice than I originally did. But that is all to say, I want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.